This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by Global Affairs Associates to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Caitlin Allen and Amanda Hsieh of Global Affairs Associates for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and co-host, and I will be collaborating with Caitlin and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that is not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Hi, everyone. This is Amanda Hsieh. Welcome back to ESG Decoded. And I'm excited to be talking to Ben Metz, the Executive Director of the Chancery Lane Project today.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi there. How are you doing?
Great. Really good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for being my guest today. On our podcast, ESG Decoded, we talk with a lot of guests on the E of ESG, the environmental, the S, the social part of ESG, and we don't have that many guests talking about the governance. So when I learned about the Chancery Lane project, I kind of jumped on this saying we have to connect, we have to get them on as a guest so we can talk about climate-friendly clauses, understand the why behind them, the what, and kind of resources available. But let me back up a second. Will you please tell us a bit about the Chancery Lane project to begin with?
Yeah, sure. I'm the executive director of the project, although interestingly, I'm not a lawyer. I hang out with lawyers because I think they're cool and they have the power to change the world. They have a huge amount of power, and with that power comes a huge amount of responsibility, channeling a bit of superhero energy there into the corporate and commercial big law world. The Chancery Lane project originates in a really simple observation. Contracts are made out of clauses. If you can change the clause, or what lawyers call the precedent clause, you can change the world. It's as simple as that. So our founder and the chair of our steering group, Matt Gingell, is a general counsel of a mid-size impact investment firm in the UK. Back in 2019, he found inspiration at the London Climate Action Week events and really took some time to think about the plumbing of law, how law works as a knowledge management system, and how the major actors in law across the world use and interact with that knowledge management system, and identified the concentration of the knowledge systems in law and the concentration in terms of the small number of large actors that execute a very large percentage of contract law around the world, combining those two and thinking about how lawyers work, cutting and pasting clauses from precedent banks, knowledge management banks, into standard form contracts as a critical leverage point in the system of law to affect change. And by taking climate considerations or net zero considerations or considerations related to the management and reduction, mitigation of greenhouse gases, or even more ambitiously, considerations related to adaptation in respect of climate change into that system, we can effectively use precedent clauses to change contracts. And in changing contracts, you can change the world. Because if you just think about it just for a minute, you very quickly realize that the vast majority of human activity on this planet is governed in some way, shape, or form by contracts.
I think that's a really interesting point to think about, and how it creates really the foundation of a lot of our relationships and how we do business with each other. And as simple as, let's say, whatever it is, getting a new cell phone or something like that or as a consumer to, a business agreement. I want to understand, and maybe you can help us explain, what are climate-friendly clauses? Are the typical clauses today? What's the difference? Are they not friendly? Are they just so neutral that they have nothing that helps a company, on their climate change, with climate action?
So within the body of business, got a fantastic quote here that came to us a couple of days ago, which is essentially contracts bring life and energy to the system of economics. They're the connective tissue between the different parts of the economic system. And currently that economic system is essentially wired for a finance first approach. So a single bottom line when you're thinking about your fiduciary duty as an investor, as a fiduciary in the economic system, rather than a double or triple bottom line, the E, the S, and the G, as well as just the financial considerations. And with that in mind, you look across the body of contract law as it stands, you find it wanting in regards to the largest existential challenge of our time. So to paraphrase and possibly distort the movie of the moment, we're not looking up, we're looking down and into contract law with regards to thinking about how we can integrate climate considerations into what is essentially a single bottom line system for the most part.
Got it. I think that just connected with me. We've talked a lot about stakeholder capitalism. There's been a big conversation that we need to create value for, of course, our shareholders, investors, but also the other stakeholders, our communities, our employees, the environment around us. And I think now I get it. How can we embed that in the fundamental kind of agreements that we have in our relationships in the contracts? And can you give us a few examples to kind of make this more practical and tangible for our listeners?
Sure. I mean, let me just take a step back first and give you a bit of context. So we're gradually realizing that we're building a global movement of lawyers who share the vision of a world where every contract enables solutions to climate breakdown. And we're finding an increasing number of young lawyers. We're working across the age groups and across the seniorities and right throughout corporate and commercial law, big law. But we're finding an increasing number of incredibly motivated, deeply passionate individuals who are engaging with us. So right now we have approaching 1,500 active participants in now more than 285 organizations, which include over 50% of what's categorized as global elite law firms or the magic circle law firms, as they were previously known. Last year, we had 27,000 unique users accessing our content across 114 countries, and about 45 countries we found participants deeply and actively engaging with drafting our content. So we work collectively and collaboratively, which is one of the unique things about this project. The Chancery project is built on a principle of collaboration and sharing, really rather in the face of a competitive market-based system. Nothing wrong with that competitive market-based system, but the opportunities for innovation and for really coming up with the most pragmatic, realizable climate solutions are often missed when there isn't that potential for collaboration. So we work collaboratively. We don't have the capacity as a team or a small team. We don't have the capacity to draft the contractual clauses, to ensure the quality and to ensure that they're utilized across the range of countries, the jurisdictions, the practice areas, the industries that we're reaching. That's 1,500 strong communities' responsibility. So, to understand the sort of current scale and potential, it's worth just framing that. One of our favorite case studies, we only found out third hand about, and that's Salesforce. So pretty much everybody in the world, certainly in where you're based and where I'm based in the UK, know about Salesforce. Salesforce attended a series of our workshops, and then one of their suppliers said that they'd received an addendum to their supply chain contract with Salesforce, requiring a binding commitment from them that they meet the science-based targets related to greenhouse gas emissions by 2024. So essentially what Salesforce had done is they'd gone onto our website after, where you'll find all of our clauses at chancerylaneproject.org. They'd gone onto our website after attending some of our sessions and understanding how to utilize the clauses, and they'd adapted them and placed them into an amendment to their supply chain contract. Their supply chain contract, then that amendment was proposed across their suppliers, and resulting in quite a considerable shift in the purchasing power of that organization. I don't think you would be surprised to find out that their annual purchasing power is in the billions. So with unbeknownst to us, material had been used by a multi-billion annual turnover purchaser to influence their supply chain.
That's huge. I used to work in supply chain many years before Global Affairs Associates and before ClimeCo. And that's really where a lot of an organization's scope 3 emissions typically lie. So to be able to use all the tools available, including the legal tools available to address that footprint.
Absolutely.
And then you mentioned this amazing network of contributors you have with the Chancery Lane project. I think two things I want to make sure our listeners know. Number one, if they're interested in learning more, there's a net zero toolkit on the chancerylane.org website. They can go there. How else can people get more information, see the clauses, but also how can they get involved?
Yeah, sure. So chancerylaneproject.org is where all of our resources are. And we encourage you as a legal professional or as a professional who engages with lawyers and contracts with them, instructs them, to review our clauses. We currently have 104 clauses on the website, which cover all manner of industries and practice areas. So if you are a procurement professional or a supply chain professional, there'll be clauses for you to think about how you green, make climate friendly or align with net zero the work that you're trying to do around management of a procurement process or a supply chain. They're accessible, they're explained before you get into the legal detail of the actual clause. So you should be able to relatively easily understand how the clause can be used and then communicate with your lawyers, your in-house team, or the company that you use, explaining what you'd like to do and introducing them to this resource. If you're a lawyer, the same thing goes. The main focal point of our website is the 104 clauses we've got. That'll be incrementally increasing in number over the coming months. We also have a toolkit, which we launched just before COP26, which was in Glasgow late last year, which gives a range of tools to allow legal professionals to understand how to utilize those clauses to either increase the ambition of those clauses in terms of aligning with an ambitious Paris-aligned target or a net zero target. We, in addition, you'll find a page listing events that we run, and we run onboarding calls 3 times a week, which support people in understanding our materials and getting orientated to them. We run events which are about utilizing our clauses. And historically, although not at the moment, so probably starting sort of middle of 2022, we will go back into a process of drafting. So we offer collaborative drafting events where individuals identify particular needs in a particular sector, industry, practice area, or jurisdiction, and we support them in a collaborative process to draft those through a rigorous peer review and editorial process, publishing them and then plugging them into our toolkit, which supports lawyers, legal professionals, and associated professionals to actually use those clauses.
That sounds great. I think it's.
I would actually add, if it's okay, that we're a philanthropically funded organization. Everything we have on our website is free to use and is offered on that basis.
Nice. I think it's wonderful. That's the way that I always think climate change and sustainability, it's a global challenge, and we need all kind of folks using their expertise, their unique experience and background to address these global issues. And I don't think you have to be a sustainability consultant to, affect change or something. I think it's wonderful that there's opportunities for those who are in the legal profession, legal experts, to contribute as well to these clauses, and just really cool organizations like the Chancery Lane Project helping to create that space for collaboration.
Yeah, I'd agree. So, broadly over the last 10 or so years, when people think about the intersection in environment and law, they think about litigation. And there's some, pretty big cases with you guys. It's Juliana versus the US over here. There's the big Shell case that's working its way through with Agenda and the second round of cases there. Or they think about legislation and policy change to legislation and then regulation. Neither of these are the subject of what we're focused on. We're focused on contract law, which is, by all accounts, the vast majority of law as it's practiced globally. It's not contentious, it's non-contentious law. So this is something where people can play well together without getting into challenging or adversarial court cases or protracted legislative policy and regulatory change processes. There's a wonderful line that we use again and again, which is enforceable climate action can be mandated immediately by adding clauses to legal agreements today.
And I like that. I think it's, just another way that we don't have to wait for our politicians to change policy. We can actually, there's something that we can do today, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. So, what we're seeing is corporate and commercial law as a huge and untapped resource in the fight against climate breakdown. And what we're actually seeing as well is that this doesn't mean we leapfrog over policy, legislative and regulatory change. It means that corporate and commercial law, as it is practiced on the ground, can be an influencer of policy, legislative and regulatory change. So it becomes a new and incredibly powerful tool in that influencing process, at the same time as giving people the tools and the agency to take the necessary levels of action that are required right now if we're not all going to fall off a cliff.
This is, when I think about it, this is a lot of similar reasons why, myself and a lot of my colleagues at ClimeCo as well choose to consult and help businesses. Yes, we do comments, to different regulatory bodies and try to influence, standard setters and policy, but our work is really about helping businesses improve because we see their role in society and their influence in society. And I think this is something else along that same line of how business has this huge role, a huge influence in society, and what we're doing with business can have a huge impact just as much as policy changes.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. And there's so many different ways to think about that. So, contracts are a mechanism for realizing climate ambition. Organizations using those contracts to achieve those net zero commitments immediately, so that so much talk is given to race to zero commitments around COP26, the Science-Based Targets Initiative commitments. We've got the new transition pathway legislation, certainly in the UK, starting to emerge, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Framework. So many voluntary regimes where people make commitments that are ahead of policy, legislative and regulatory change, and a paucity of delivery mechanisms in the short term to actually allow these commitments to be realized and then to cascade down and up supply and value chains. So it's hugely interesting. The other thing I think is particularly interesting because we're just starting to engage with public sector bodies, initially in the UK and a couple of other European countries, around their procurement. And so one large government body has adopted a bunch of our clauses in their supply chain contracts, and now they're starting to talk about across 17 other UK government departments. Really interesting kind of cascade function. But actually, when you start looking at the nature of different types of contracts in the public sector, some of those contracts are much closer to having purchase on policy, legislative and regulatory change than others. The example I think that applies to the US as it does to the UK and Europe is around transport infrastructure. So the framework agreements that govern the building of roads and the building and maintenance of roads and rail are much closer in form to the legislation and regulation than you might find in fast-moving consumer goods or soft commodities or hard commodities. And as a consequence, if we started to think about engaging with those verticals in the public sector in terms of procurement, you may end up with on-the-ground contracting changes having a greater and more rapid influence on that legislative and regulatory change that is necessary in the long term. So there's some really interesting observations in the system of law, corporate and commercial law, that are worth thinking about from a policy change point of view.
And the other thing that I think about is when in the Salesforce example, we were talking in the billions. When we're talking about government contracting, it's trillions or more, so that the impact can be even greater.
Yeah, absolutely. My hope, after a conversation with a number of East Coast and West Coast academics yesterday, actually, who have been providing some informal advice to parts of the US government, is that we could do a bit of a speed dating opportunity with some of the UK government thinkers who've been leading the way in supply chain contracting changes here, with the people that these academics have been talking to in the States. So, I get frustrated often by our funders requiring hard outputs in tonnage and, the classic key performance indicators of philanthropic funding, when actually the real outcomes are in the relationships that are built, the trust that those relationships build, that allow people to take one idea that's being deployed in one location and transpose it across to another.
And are there any final thoughts as we wrap up this podcast? What should I have asked you that I didn't?
What am I having for dinner? I don't know.
Or we can rephrase it this other way.
No, so for me, there's a really interesting piece here that we haven't really unpacked yet, which is around risk. So risk is the language of law in many ways, and lawyers are charged with managing risk for their clients. So from a client's point of view, understanding the nature, the time frame, and the extent of the risks posed by climate change in the broadest sense of the term is critical information that informs the context within which legal work is done. So all I can do for your listeners, suggest to your listeners, is encourage them to think about climate risks within the context of their work, and reach out through chancery-project.org or through any of the other resources at the interface of law and climate change on the environment, to think about trying to make sense of how those risks are going to change over time. There's legislative risk, there's transition risk, there's financial risk, et cetera, and engage with their in-house teams, engage with the lawyers that they work with, to think about how they can manage that through their supply chains.
That's one of some of our projects that we've been working on, is helping our clients understand the gamut of climate risk and how using the task force on climate related financial disclosures as a framework to think about climate risk, how they may impact the organization, as you said, in various timeframes. And also, as that framework mentions, there's also climate opportunities as well sometimes for many companies, depending on what they're doing, and thinking through that. And I think that's, for us, our kind of go-to framework that we've been using and that we see as being widely adopted around the world as the leading framework for understanding and climate risk, and how, especially for a corporate player, and how it translates to and impacts their business.
Yeah, so if you were going to ask me the question again, I would say that's a really interesting question. I would encourage your listeners to think about what the delivery mechanism is that they are going to be using to realize the commitments they've made, whether that is a part of a TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework, whether that's a voluntary commitment through, for instance, Race to Zero, whether that's signing up to the Science Based Targets Initiative, whether that's reporting to CDP or any one of the other frameworks or standard setters that exist out there. What are the delivery mechanisms that they can use to actually bring their commitments to life. And the solution that we've come to, the answer we've come to is it's the contracts.
And thank you so much for being my guest today. This has been fascinating. I think this is a conversation that around, contracts and governance that we normally don't have guests speaking on. So I think this will be just a topic that I'm hoping our listeners are just eating up right now.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for your time. And anything we can do to help your listeners, yourself, we're at your service.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours, and follow ESG Decoded and Global Affairs Associates across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and for the planet.